inviting us to this wonderful seminar. This would give us a chance, opportunity to share a little bit with you all, something of our experience and any information that we have. Yeah. So the topic that we have been given to talk about is legal interpreting for the deaf, challenges and opportunities. Lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities, actually. Right, so for a start, most deaf people that I met and I've known of, they're nice people. I can't imagine, I can't think of any reason why they would find themselves in a situation where they need legal interpreting. But anyway, having said that, legal interpreting has a wider scope than court interpreting. For example, a wider scope, and it includes different stages and settings in the judicial process. Yeah. For example, interviews in police stations. They may find themselves, you know, in a police station having to probably give some statement, or in fact, you know, probably as an accused or you know, something like that. But also may find themselves in a lawyer's office, in communication, lawyer-client communication, in the judge's chamber. You know, there are some sensitive cases where they don't do it in the open court. Yeah, so they can also find themselves in a trial hearings in the open court. So, speaking of the situation in Malaysia, in other countries, in other more advanced countries, like this is slide number 4. I see that. Yeah, I see my PowerPoint on the page, so slide number 4. Is that number 4? Probably 3. Yeah. So, as far as court interpreting service in Malaysia for the deaf is concerned, we find that social awareness of sign languages, of sign language interpreting, providing sign language courses and sign language interpreter training, creating a register or registers of qualified and certified interpreters. These are more advanced, more developed in developed countries, in advanced countries, like the United States or Canada, United Kingdom, or and Europe. Unlike the majority of less developed countries, including Malaysia. And the reasons being inadequate resources, either financial, intellectual, and most of all, I think it's lack of political will. The authorities are not keen to develop the service as yet. So in Malaysia, there are 2 major forms of sign language in use. The KTBM and the other language of choice of the deaf community as a whole, and this is the BIM. The BIM is recognized since 2008 in OKU Act, but only for education. But the federal court has their own appointed sign language interpreter, but lawyers can bring their own. Okay, next slide. So in Malaysia, talking about the communities in Malaysia, we have a population of 32.6 million according to the Department of Statistics Malaysia 2020. There are three major communities: the Malay, 70% of the population, Chinese 22%, Indian 7%, and minor communities from indigenous group, Pribumi, particularly in East Malaysia, and several migrant groups, 1%. So Bahasa Malaysia is used between the citizen and the state, the medium of instruction in state schools and tertiary institutions, and is the language of trial and record in the courts. So the courts, the police, and the medical services expect the general public to use Malay in their dealings with the authorities. And interpreters, whether spoken and signed, provide the communication link for those not proficient in BM. So the next slide, please. So as far as public service interpreting is concerned, other than in the courts, public service interpreting in Malaysia is almost nil. So individuals who are either bilingual service providers, for example, a doctor or police officer, or who speaks Malay and another language, or family members or friends provide what we call ad hoc interpreting when it is needed. Yeah, so deaf people have to learn some form of sign language. They simply have to learn some form of sign language to communicate and to receive interpreting service. Otherwise, they may be excluded from the life, from the service in the country, from the life, from the rest of the nation, and even with their own families. So for them, contact with society outside their own community depends entirely on those who can interpret between speech and sign. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this is something I wish to say to all our deaf friends out there. If you find yourself in the police station for whatever reason and for whatever offense, it is your right to have an access to an interpreter. So politely insist on a sign language interpreter who can communicate with you to help you in an urgent situation involving the police, the hospital, or the courts, or any government department. This is important to bear in mind. You are not alone and you're not helpless. Okay? So, next slide. So coming back to the courts, we take comfort in the fact that the Criminal Procedure Code, CPC 270, ensures the right of an individual to the services of an interpreter if she is involved in court, appearing as accused, appearing as litigant, appearing as defendant, or a witness. The provision states that whenever any evidence is given in a language not understood by the accused, and he is present in person, it shall be interpreted to him in open court in a language which he understands. Chapter 25, Clause 270. So it is automatically recognized that a deaf person requires an interpreter. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the court interpreter's role and responsibilities. First and foremost, the interpreter is a language service provider and all that it implies, yeah, and that is he or she ensures the deaf understands the proceedings, and he or she provides competent interpreting. He or she must be skilled communicator, and that implies a lot, right? He or she is the link between those who lack a common culture and means of communication. He or she presents the facts. This is important. The facts must be presented on which the trial and justice depends. Without that, there is no trial and no justice. So the role is really quite heavy on the court interpreter. Yeah. So the challenges that a court interpreter faces. The next slide, please. All right. So the challenges in court, as far as the interpreter is concerned, and much more sign language interpreters, even with the provisions in the CPC, legal interpreting for the deaf could be severely restricted for a number of reasons. Number one, there are very few sign interpreters available in court. I remember research, there's a small survey I did like 13 years ago. The MFD, the president at the time, I think Sazali at the time, says that there were 100 interpreters. This is supposed what they are supposed to have trained. There are 100, but actually after the survey and those who responded, only about 7. And of the 7, only 1 was qualified, accredited. And that was like what, 13, 14 years ago. I'm not sure how it is now. We need another survey to find out. So yeah, so number one, there are very few sign interpreters available. And number two, those that are available tend to be untrained. And number three, I'm not sure about this, but as far as I know, there is no national agreement on which sign language or other systems in use in the country should be officially adopted. And number four, the courts tend to prefer civil servants. They tend to prefer their own type. And this means teachers of the deaf. However, from the survey that I did some years ago, the teachers of the deaf, representatives of the NGOs, they reported that they face major problems as legal interpreters. Yeah. And last but not least is interpreting in court is difficult. It's difficult. Okay. So next slide. Next slide is just some example. Next slide. Some example of difficulties of interpreting in court. After this, I'm just showing some of the difficult words. So the difficulties of interpreting in court, I think from the research by some colleagues in Europe, it's they say that the most difficult and the least paid is interpreting in the court. So the trial process itself is intricately complex, from arrest to verdict. And any deviations from this rigid procedure will damage the case. Again, there are specialist, very specialist terminology and subtle usages in court. There are rules of evidence that interpreters must know, rules of evidence, precedents, and procedures. And again, there is the content of the legal text underlying the legal arguments. And of course, the subject matter of the case, criminal, civil, murder, manslaughter, etc., and the irreversible consequences to the parties involved if mistakes are made and communication is faulty. So all of these tend to create stress in the interpreter. It's really a stressful job for the interpreter in the courts. And of course, the difficulties of sign language interpreting. There are deaf people, those who don't, those who are what you called, I've forgotten the words, diminish language competence. They are the most difficult to interpret in court. And again, the other difficulties is that interpreters, they have multiple roles, whether they like it or not. They have multiple roles, interpreters in court. Yeah? So therefore, it is no surprise that interpreters admit to feelings of inadequacies and then emotional exhaustion. So, no, even though my research was quite a while ago, but it was a nationwide survey of about 900 interpreters. There are more, I think, today. But at that time, in the year 2000, there are about 900 court interpreters in the whole of Malaysia. And almost, I think 95% of them said that they feel a sense of inadequacies and emotional exhaustion from the job. You know, and I'm not sure that has changed now. Next slide, please. Some examples of language in court. A lot of terms from Latin, for example, habeas corpus, quid pro quo, bona fide, alibi, etc., etc. And their unique usages. Unique usages, common words with uncommon meaning. Yeah, so words like the bench, the bar, motion, plead, prayer, murder versus manslaughter. This has grave implications, as will be described by Prof. Bell afterwards. The third one is there are formal expressions the interpreter must know. So approach the bench, for example, with the greatest of respect. Yeah, and as the honorable court pleases. So this is what they use in the court, and we have to learn it. Discharge not amounting to acquittal. It's even in sign language, it's not easy to say that, isn't it? Discharge not amounting to acquittal. You are, you can go now, but you're not free, kind of thing. Yeah? Right. And then there are this questioning form. Lawyers questioning witness or defendants, questioning form, the form of the question itself, the coercion and the constraint, and the increased degree of coercion in the questioning. The questioning itself is very stressful. Some people got confused by it. The next one is the term, the form of, expression in court. It's called re-question. Can you go back to the last slide. Re-questions. For re-question is a question like this. Can you tell us what you did? It sounds like asking your ability, can you? But actually, they want the witness to, not want, they demand information from the witness. It is not, you know, ask, trying to be polite, or can you not, right? So the next form of questions is WH questions. What did you do? Where were you? What time? Why? Not why. When? Where? Yeah. And next type of question is interrogatives. Did you do it? For example, yeah. Did you do it? Yes, no question. Yeah? And then declaratives is just again confusing the defendant or witness, like you did it, and you know, sort of elements of surprise to the hearer. You did it, didn't you? Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is just what shall I say, like a general knowledge, stages in guilty plea procedures for interpreters to know, and for deaf people in general also to know, because I'm sure you haven't been in court, but this is the procedure. First, the interpreter will call out the case, like you know, Wong versus Lim or something like that, or so and so versus the government, for example. Yeah, so the interpreter will verify identity, occupation, and address of the accused. Next, the interpreters will read the charge, will read it out, and this is if the accused does not is not proficient in Malay, this one will be interpreted in whatever language, including sign language. Then the interpreter will explain the consequence of the plea, and then ask the second time. So do you plead guilty or not guilty? Ya, mengaku salah atau mengaku tidak bersalah, kind of thing. Yeah? And then the interpreter will record the plea and convey it to the bench. If the accused maintain guilty plea, the PO, the prosecuting officer, will detail the offense, will read out the facts of the case. And then the interpreter will ask if the accused agrees with the facts. Okay, and then if the accused agrees with the facts, exhibits will be tendered and the interpreter will proceed with mitigation. So this is the simple procedure. If he or she agrees, then it ends there. You know, we'll proceed to mitigation, and the bench will note down the mitigation and proceed with the sentence. If the accused disagree, then a whole set of trials will follow after that. Witnesses will be called, and exhibits will be tendered in, and so on. All right, so I'm just sharing the straightforward case. Okay, next slide. Right, so I'm coming to the end of my side of the presentation. Just some recommendations for facilitating justice, in which sign language interpreters and the deaf might be involved. Yeah. So there is already an existing network of service providers like Jupiter, like even MFD. Yeah. So what is needed next is to develop and expand this network in a recognized organization. An organization that is able to to give accreditation, some academic institution, for example. So this organization can set about running training schemes, establishing accreditation linkages with local institutions or with local international tertiary institutions. Then following that, the development of codes of ethics and good practice, which will lead to professionalization of the sign language interpreter service, including legal interpreting. All right, so with that, I end my part of the presentation, and Prof. Bell will take over. Thank you, Lucy. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Hi. Hello.
Next slide. You have to call it out.
Right. So can I have the next slide, please? Right. I put this here just to start off by saying, look how long we have been doing interpreting. This is how long we are sure we have been doing interpreting. It must go back many, many centuries before that. But this is the first picture of it. Next slide, please. Actually, it goes back another 200 years, and there is a reference you see to Genesis, to the Old Testament. Joseph, the coat of many colors, Joseph understood the people because he was using an interpreter. So we have documentary evidence of that. And of course, I say it again, it goes way, way back before that. So let me tell you now, we keep those on for the moment. Let me tell you now what I want to do. I want, first of all, to recognize that there is constant worldwide threat to the human rights of all minority communities, including the deaf in Malaysia. This is constant. And as a result of that, I want to propose something that Dr. Zubaydah was hinting at, and that is the creation of a coordinated system of public service interpreting. And I would suggest, just because I know about it and I don't know much about what you have actually done, what I would suggest is it could be partially based on experiences that we've had in the UK since the 1980s. But I'll expand on that later. So next slide, please. This is what can go wrong. This is why it is so important that we have good interpreting in the courts. This is a classic case of an appalling miscarriage of justice, a dreadful miscarriage of justice. And it was caused entirely by grossly incompetent interpreting. And I'm tempted to say to you, read it for yourself, because it's quite lengthy, but I can summarize. We're talking about a Punjabi woman, an illiterate Punjabi woman who, after years of abuse from her husband, took a heavy object, hit him on the head and killed him. She only spoke Punjabi. She didn't speak English. She had presumably been practicing the phrase, "I've just murdered my husband," because she went to the police station and said that. She was put on trial and insisted, absolutely insisted, that she had murdered her husband. She insisted on pleading guilty to murder. The judge, through an interpreter appointed by the defense, asked her again and again, do you understand the difference between murder and manslaughter? The difference is important because murder, if you're found guilty of it, you get life imprisonment. That is mandatory. Manslaughter, you could just have a few years in prison. Depends on the a lot of the things in the case. And the judge has latitude, in case of manslaughter, has latitude to just sentence somebody to a small number of years in jail. She insisted, she was found guilty, she was put in jail, and 4 years later, a prison visitor, Punjabi speaking, discovered that the interpreter, so-called, didn't speak Punjabi. He spoke Gujarati and English, and Gujarati and Punjabi are as mutually intelligible as spoken Malay and spoken Tagalog. They're not. Or American Sign Language and British Sign Language. They are not intelligible. A few words here and there. There was an appeal, it went to trial again on appeal. It was immediately accepted. She was told by the judge to plead guilty to manslaughter and was immediately released because the judge said she had been unable to plead. She couldn't tell the difference between manslaughter and murder. And so there was what appeared to be a trial, but it was not a trial. It was a nullity. So she was released. So end of story, except, poor woman, she wandered the streets afterwards, couldn't get in contact with her children, finally committed suicide. I think you can't imagine a more awful miscarriage of justice caused entirely by faulty interpreting. It had a good effect in that it terrified the judges who realized that if there was this one miscarriage of justice that they knew about, how many other cases had there been? And it was from that that ultimately we got our public service interpreting system. So next, please. Next. Right. I just want to say something very quickly about human rights. The point about providing an interpreter anywhere is that it has to do with a human right. And it is one of the challenges that we would actually like to look at. The human rights, there are a whole lot of them. It would take more than the time we've got to go through them. But the basic ones are, of course, the ones that we would recognize, like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, poor Iqbal Begum neither had liberty nor happiness because of it. And there are a whole lot of declarations from the United Nations in particular. And if these are accepted by the United Nations and then by countries that sign up to them, there is an obligation on the countries to create facilities and provide access to protect those rights. And that's fine, except that the quality and the effectiveness of the actual provision is far from universal, as Dr. Zubaydah has been telling you. So many individuals find themselves limited or even unable entirely to access the services that are supposed to be provided. linguistic minorities and disabled people tend to be adversely affected. Some improvements. There's the date of a couple of declarations, but deaf people in particular, as you well know, face major obstacles. Accessing the system. There's not much point having a right if you can't actually use that right. I have the right to walk on a public footpath in a field in the country, but that's not much use to me if the gate is locked and nobody has a key, just to put it in a trivial way. So there are also terminological and conceptual confusions. Very often, even the drafters of laws and so forth are confused about things which we know are actually the same or different. And the classic for Malaysia, I'm afraid, is the, I'm sorry, I have to turn over my page, that in Malaysia, the deaf community are defined as disabled and also as a minority language community. Well, there are United Nations declarations on disability and also on minority language rights. Well, which is the community? That's an issue that has to be sorted out, because at present there are conflicting recommendations or indeed rights. And a worse one, I think, which is that in the laws of Malaysia, this is the act that Dr. Zubaydah referred to, the official language of the Malaysian, the deaf community is Malaysia Sign Language, Malaysia Sign Language, not Malaysian Sign Language. Well, you know that Malaysia Sign Language is BIM, Malaysian Sign Language. Malaysia Sign Language maybe refers to KTBM. There is a confusion that has to be sorted out, and this is not uncommon. So, if I could go on to the next slide, please. Right, there's some human rights. I hope you can read them. I can't, but that has something to do with my eyes. So on again, please. Next slide. Okay, there you are. That I can read. Sign language is a human right. It's not just an option. We need to tell the rest of the population that. Okay, next slide, please. Right. We get into challenges and opportunities. I'd like to sort of very quickly go through these. What I'm interested in is actually kind of presenting some, not all, of the challenges that we face. Challenges are also opportunities. A challenge, after all, is some kind of problem or issue or something which is not satisfactory. And we have an opportunity, whether we can do it, we have the opportunity to correct the situation and to get rid of the problem. So this is why I've not separated out challenges and opportunities. I see them as two sides of the same coin. The crucial thing is to expand the idea of protecting rights of linguistic minorities beyond the law to other communicative domains, health, the government departments in general, and so on. And that's something that I'm going to propose to you in a few moments. The argument for doing that is economies of scale. Because if you design a comprehensive system which supports all situations in which all users of minority languages interact with official institutions of the state, you save money. It's more efficient if you have some kind of coherent, comprehensive system. The other thing that has to be done is to maximize ease of access for all languages, spoken or signed. As I said, if you don't have access, there's no point having de jure the right when de facto you don't. And something which is kind of dear to my heart, and that is to recognize and harness the bilingual skills which are present in a multilingual community. This is a multilingual community. Multilingual communities are the norm in the world, even in the UK, where British people really think everybody speaks English. They do, but a lot of people speak 2 or more languages. And there are, of course, deaf people using sign languages. I'm going to show how we would actually make something like recognizing and harnessing bilingual skills, something that would help in what we're talking about. So next one, please. So what are we going to need? We're going to need to provide, as again, we're repeating ourselves a bit, professional training, appropriate pay and conditions, and personal support for those who bridge the communication gap between the minorities, that's the interpreters, and state officials. We have a paradoxical situation where the best paid interpreters in the world are those who interpret for international conferences. And the paradox is that those who interpret for really important things, like the law, are the worst paid. Quite a paradox. Okay, we need to work towards statutory regulation and protected title for interpreters. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And currently, almost everywhere in the world, anyone who can speak 2 languages can offer their services as an interpreter or a translator. I speak French and English, so I can be an interpreter. No, I can't. I would hate to do it. I'd be terrible at it. Now, these are not protected titles. There are protected titles which can only be used by individuals who are either trained, doctors are an example, or members of specific trade union association, trade association. You may not, in most countries, say that you are a doctor and practice as a doctor without committing a criminal offense. But anybody can say they're a translator or an interpreter. Well, that will not do. And we have to work towards actually getting protected titles for translators. Right, I'm getting near the end, I think. The stake, sorry, next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Right, the stakeholders. The stakeholders are incredibly important in this. We need to find out who the, no, it's the slide before that, please. Thank you. We need to discover who the stakeholders are who are involved in providing interpreting services. Let me say what a stakeholder is. A stakeholder is a person or a group or an organization that can, positively or negatively, have an impact on or be affected by the actions or activities of others. We're talking about uneven power relationships, actually. And the crucial distinction is whether the stakeholder has high or low interest in something, and how much influence they have. Do they have high influence or low influence? So in our case, we could find a stakeholder and we would say, well, how interested are you in this? Are you really interested, or no, not at all? And what could you do about it to make it better or worse? Do you have high influence, high impact? So we need, once we've found out, and we need to fill in the boxes to work out who the stakeholders are, we need to engage with the stakeholders. I'm sorry. These will be linguistic and other minorities, because you can make common cause with other minorities. There is a danger, I think, for a minority to feel that it is on its own and it has to just do things for itself. But so much is shared. Well, you can work together. I'm sure you do. I have to admit huge ignorance about what you have achieved. I'm sorry. The other group are members of the other caring professions. Interpreting is a caring profession. If you're an interpreter, you care. You care about your client, as lawyers do, as doctors do, as social workers do. You wouldn't do it if you didn't care. And more broadly, government departments, educational institutions, and so forth, the NGOs. So can I have the next slide, please? So this is, we need to take action. We need to find out who is in the low interest, high influence group, and we need to give them information. The high interest, low influence group, we need to get involved and we need to consult with them. There may be people who are very interested, but they don't have any influence. Well, we have to involve them, consult with them, see how we can help them to increase their influence. And the third group is the opposite of that. This is low interest and high influence. There are people who have no interest whatsoever, and if they actually did something, they could do something practical. The judges in the Begum case are the classic example. Low interest suddenly is turned into high interest when they realize that their profession is actually under attack by failing to provide justice. Well, we need, if they have low interest, we need to inform them and educate them, make them realize how they should have high interest. And here are our potential partners, people with high interest and high influence, and we collaborate with them, of course. But I'd say it again, we have to find out how we fill these 4 boxes, because it will differ from country to country and from time to time, and we need to have up-to-date information, which I'm sure we don't have. I don't think anybody has for any particular activity. I'd like to add into our list, before I bring this to a close, I'd like to bring in some other people. We need to add in the universities. Sorry, I should have the next slide. I'm sorry, I should have said. Right, if we, oh, okay, right. Could you go back to the earlier one? Right, we're actually at no, sorry, this is my fault. Leave it at that as it is. We need to add into the list we had The universities, definitely, because one, we need organizations that know how to do research and find out all this information for us. We also need to have the blessing of a university and the quality assurance that a university can provide. And indeed, the prestige of a university is something that would be very helpful for us. And the other thing is, of course, there are large companies who have money that they will put into charities and good causes and so on. And there are the actual charities like Rotary and the Lions and so on, who would fund small-scale research funds. I was sad to hear earlier about the BIM television, that you don't have funding to support it. That's something I would go and twist the arms of Rotary or the Lions or one of the large companies and say, look, you know, this is a good cause. We don't want a lot of money. Please help us. So I want to add them to the list. And once we have all this, we can make plans. But, as Peter Drucker famously says, plans are just good ideas until they degenerate into hard work. Well, I know. If you would have me, and if I can provide anything helpful, I will engage in hard work with you. You just have to ask. So, on to the last slide then, please. Sorry, the next slide. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is the creation of coordinated national programs for the development of public service interpreting. And creating programs like that calls for sharing international experience and expertise, discovering solutions, selecting and adapting some of them to local needs. And I'm going to suggest to you the potentially useful model of post-UK 1980s, if only because I was involved in that. So next slide, please. Okay, maybe this sounds too much. Is it impossible? I'm going to say no. If we set reasonable goals, then we can do it. This is a quote from Paddy Ashdown, who literally brought peace to the Balkans during the Balkans War. And he says, the task, I'll read it right through because I like it a lot. The task is not to seek perfection, but to achieve the most acceptable form of imperfection possible. The result is not intended as an encyclopedia of actions whose implementation will guarantee success. But rather, as a practitioner's compendium of things that may work because they have worked in the past, and others that may fail because they have led to failure in the past. A very reasonable way, I think, of looking at it. Even tiny improvements for a community which is not getting it right are improvements. Right, now here's my actual proposal, and this, I promise you, is the end. So next slide, please. Okay, so what we set up with the blessing and the huge support of the judges was the National Register for Public Service Interpreters. Now, what this is an independent voluntary regulator of professional interpreters, so a regulator. And what it provides is free, online, searchable, public service register of professional, qualified and accountable interpreters. And the link is there, and it's free. So if you're interested, you can do it. This, in order to get onto the register, you have to, first of all, get the Certificate of Bilingual Skills. Now, this was my point about drawing on the bilingual talent in any country. And this is a school leaver level, A-level equivalent of practical skills, speaking, signing and writing, and it's at 5 levels. It's run on the basis of the National Vocational Awards for things like music. I may say, actually, I'd like to play the piano. Well, there are actually 1 to 9 levels, and I may do the first one, and I'll take the test when I want to, and I can take it as many times as I like, and I can carry on to the next level, or I can say, oh, I'll stop. I just wanted to play a few tunes. I may get to level 3 and they say, now you learn to read music. And I say, don't want to read music. I want to play by ear. And this is like that, very, very practical. And we have in Britain a lot of young people who have grown up speaking 2 languages, but by the time they're in their teens, they don't write, they're illiterate in their mother tongue, and the spoken version of their mother tongue is that of a child, because increasingly they've been speaking English and writing it at school. So it's a question of leveling up the competence in the 2 languages. You may have something very similar with deaf people, I don't know. Yeah. These are run by the local authority further education colleges and the NGOs, and they're examined by the Institute of Linguists. The final one is, if you wanted to go on, you could do the Diploma in Public Service Interpreting. This is degree level, and it's a qualification for people who would like to work or are working in one of the 3 public services, the law. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Stop. Right. No, back. Right. It's at the bottom there. Right. So the law, courts, solicitors, police stations, immigration, healthcare, hospitals, clinics, GP practices, local government, housing, social work, education, all 3 of those. Universities run them, and we ran one right at the beginning, training trainers for DIPSI. We had a lot of interpreters or potential interpreters, but nobody to train them. So we just did 1 course, 6 months, intensive, full-time, and for 20 languages. And that was it. Never again. So there you are. Last slide, please. There you are. I just wanted to put that in. Liaison interpreting is still going on after 3,600 years. And it looks very like the Egyptian frieze, doesn't it? With the kind of Siamese twin interpreter. There, that is that. I apologize if what I've been saying sounds like neo-imperialism. It's not intended to be. Thank you.
Doctor, do you know how interpreters can solve the problems if the deaf the lack of signing skills For example, the parents never, I mean, they didn't send their children to the school or for education, and they do not know well about signing.
Yeah. Can the interpreter solve the problem if the deaf plaintiff doesn't know how to sign?
Yes, this has been a question from long time ago. It's the same question. Yeah. This is why I said,
Yes, Dr. Z, proceed.
Yes.
yeah, this is why I said earlier that the deaf community, deaf individuals, they really have to learn some form of sign language, and their parents cannot keep them at home. This is one of the first thing we must tell them for, you know, situations like this. So coming back to that question, if the deaf person is brought to court and he doesn't, you know, he doesn't sign any BIM or KTPM or whatever, what is the interpreter going to do? You know, and this is really a difficult question. So the interpreter in that case can only resort to his or her creativity and compassion for the deaf, you know, by using signs, I mean, not formal signs that the person, the child or the adult can understand, and also maybe by drawing, making drawing and showing him or her what is meant. And well, apart from drawing and making unofficial signs, and perhaps even writing, if this person knows any writing system. This is all that I can think of. But here the interpreter will have to play this role, you know, not insisting on you know, formal sign language, but you know, her or his own creativity to help the deaf person. Yeah. So yeah, learn sign language. Get parents to teach, to let their children learn. Okay.
So if the deaf people or the deaf person cannot afford to pay the fee for the services of the interpreter, how?
Should be free.
Or in terms of interpreters' fee, in the criminal court, our court system pays the interpreter. Not much, you know, really not much. It's really quite a joke actually. But yeah, the government, the courts pay criminal cases, and civil cases, usually the lawyers would pay. Or the deaf might pay for it themselves if it's, for example, yeah, civil cases, divorce cases, traffic offense. If it is not provided for them, they will have to pay for themselves. Okay.
Thank you. The next question is, so we get the hearing interpreter service for the court.
Yeah.
Can we get a deaf interpreter as the interpreter for the court?
As well, that means it's a partnership.
It's a partnership, like a relay interpreting.
Yes, it's been answered by Lucy. Well, there is such a thing as relay interpreting, you know, yeah. Two interpreters are involved in that case.
but both need to be trained.
Okay. Anything else?
So the next question is, I want to ask Dr. Z, for the discussion about legal cases and progress. So we use the interpreter service. Do we use the same interpreter as before court and also for the court with the same interpreter?
Let me rephrase that, Dr. Z and Professor Bell. If the deaf person or the lawyer uses that one interpreter in the police station, would the lawyer use the same interpreter in court settings?
Depends. If the defense is paying. So if the defense is paying, the defense would check with the client. And there are, of course, I didn't say this because we didn't have time, but there are people in Britain who are police interpreters. So they have done the DIPSI, but they have specialized on the police station rather than the court. So it's a question of how far the defense, who would be paying, I imagine, how far the defense would want to choose one or the other. After all, sorry, the role of the defense is to do the very best for the client. So they would be well informed, they would decide, or they would recommend more correctly.
Okay. So the next question we have, how do we know that the interpreter truly, know what he or she is doing in the court, in legal interpreting?
You don't.
Proficient, yeah, proficient.
Yeah, proficiency. How do we know how proficient is one interpreter as in doing it in the legal interpreting?
Well, in the courts will want some evidence of what legal interpreting this interpreter has done before. It may not be formal qualification, it may not be formal, it may not be official, but because of the shortage or none at all of qualified legal interpreting, this is the only recourse they have, to ask them, have you done this before? And then the next would be, do you, they take the oath, okay? They take the oath. Yeah, that is the most important thing to them in court, to take the oath. Yeah.
Could I add that in Britain, after we got the register organized, there was an act of parliament that said that as from January the 1st, every police station and every court in the whole of the United Kingdom must have a qualified interpreter available. There is a problem, of course, and that is, how many thousands of interpreters are you going to need? How many hundreds of language pairs are you going to need? How can you get somebody from Glasgow to Oban in the middle of the night to interpret Pushtu? I mean, it's a gigantic problem. And of course, not just the law, but health and social services as well.
But let me just add a little bit. in Malaysia, in our case, we just need someone qualified in sign language and BM or English. This will work from Kedah to Johor.
Yeah, you're lucky.
Yeah. Sign language proficiency, English and BM.
But you may have the access problem, particularly in East Malaysia, where traveling is difficult. So you have to have an interpreter available, but may have to travel a long distance. That's true in Scotland, for example, and to some extent in Wales, because bilingualism is usually an urban phenomenon. So, you know, I think East Malaysia is very, very problematic.
Yeah. Yeah, we often forget East Malaysia.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, it's 3:22 now.
Oh yeah. Oh dear.
Okay.
Okay, wait.
We have
there
two
are
more.
two more last.
Okay.
Last two question.
All right.
Okay.
So many of the deaf here have fluent in the sign language, like they could do it themselves in interview, job interviews, you know, they can protect themselves, they can defend. So
But they usually exclude from that. You know, even though they can write well, they can say something and all that, but they've always been excluded. So what do you think of that?
Excluded from?
Oh, from job opportunities, for example, because the job requires them to call or to communicate using phone, or has similar requirements.
Well, you can't employ somebody who can't speak on the phone, can you?
In relation to legal interpreting?
Sorry, what Anthony meant was there are deaf people who are proficient, have the correct qualification, but still excluded in the workforce. Not accepted in the workforce.
But by the employer when they're trying to get the job, or by other workers?
Employer.
Yes, by the employer.
Well, then I think they have a legal right to actually take that person to court, because they have been excluded wrongly, unless it's something which requires speech, obviously.
Okay.
I don't know if you can get a test case of some sort.
Yeah, a test case. Precedence. Make a court case of it.
Yeah, that's a question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You need a lawyer.
But
you need a good lawyer.
Do you have employment tribunals in this country?
Yes, we do have tribunal.
Well,
I think we need to check. We need to find out.
Yeah, I mean, I would, in such a situation, I would join the trades union and go straight to the tribunal.
It's
Yes, all right.
something-
Proceed
yeah.
to the last question.
Okay.
If the deaf community must get the interpreter service, but the deaf couldn't afford, what's your opinion about it? This is a repeated question, Dr. and Prof.
Well, as Dr. Zubaida said, if it's legal and it's a criminal case, then it's free, right? That is your right. If it's not a criminal case, then you have to find a defense who will do it pro bono for you, or who will ask you to pay 50% or whatever.
Okay.
Mhm.
Good. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Z and Prof. Bell.
You are most
For the
welcome.
amazing presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. You're most welcome.
Anything to help, we care too.